Okay, and now I'm really glad to introduce Jonathan Pinckney. He's on my right. He's an assistant professor of political science in the School of Economical, Political, and Policy Sciences at the University of Texas. Before, he was also the director of applied research for the Horizons Project, where he led research on countering democratic backsliding. He has also worked as a senior researcher at the United States Institute of Peace, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and an external associate at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. He was also a research fellow at CTUCAN Center for International Security and Diplomacy, where he supervised data collection for the Social Conflict Analysis database. His research on civil resistance, democratization, and peace building has been widely published. And his first book, From Dissent to Democracy, The Promise and Peril of Civil Resistance Transition, was published in 2020. Please welcome Dr. Jonathan Pinckney. Thanks.
There we go. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Nicholas, and thanks so much to Ken and Marie for the invitation to be here, and to Kathleen for such a wonderful first talk to get this discussion going. So what I'm going to focus on in my talk is this question that I appreciate it came up in the discussion already, of what comes after nonviolent resistance. What does nonviolent resistance build? What are, not just in the short-term moment of success, of concession, but over the longer term, after a movement has ended, what actually happens? And what kinds of gains are made and what kinds of gains are not made? And what are some of the complications there? And the screen is dim, so I think you can't really see it too clearly. But I have as an indicative example up here, Tahrir Square in 2011 during the revolution, which was, I think, has a very personal connection for me as well. This is how I got interested in studying this sort of thing. Because I spent some time in Egypt before the revolution, and when the revolution happened, the shock of it, the surprise of it, got me very excited about understanding how this sort of thing can happen. And then, of course, for those of you who are familiar with the years following, how can things go so wrong afterwards? Why do we have kind of this moment of incredible hope where, you know, the people of a country are coming together to create this moment of transformational change, and then you have, you know, years of political infighting followed by a military coup and a dictatorship that is in many ways even worse than the one that preceded the revolution. And so I was really, you know, I really wanted to better understand, how do we get to this moment? And then how do we get to the moment that came after? And are the gains of nonviolent resistance, when it comes to things like the advancement of democracy and the protection of human rights that came up in the previous talk, when and why are those things actually sustained? So this question of what does nonviolence leave behind after it? And this is particularly critical because, as you can see on the map here, nonviolent resistance has been one of the most significant forces in leading to major political transformations around the world. This data that populates the map is from my 2020 book that looked at all political transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance from the end of the Second World War up until the Arab Spring. A population of around 80 political transitions in every region of the world, in every kind of political regime, with every kind of different sort of political context. And so just as Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham brought up previously, there are many thousands of smaller movements pursuing nonviolent resistance for reasons of self-determination. There are also huge numbers of major moments of political transformation. Some of them that we are all, we may be familiar with, the Arab Spring, the fall of the Berlin Wall, this sort of thing, but many others whose names we are not familiar with, but nonetheless in their countries of origin led to major transformational political outcomes. And so the first question to start with, and I'm not going to bury the lead here, is the question of, particularly with the example of Egypt in mind that I started with, does this actually lead to positive change? Does this actually lead, when people rise up against a dictatorship, do they actually end up with more democracy, with more protection for their human rights than they had before the revolution? And the answer is an unequivocal yes. The data on this is abundantly clear. This data also comes from my 2020 book, where I looked at those 80 transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance and compared them to around 400 transitions initiated through other means. So whether that be violent revolutions, top-down processes of liberalization, basically anything else that might lead an authoritarian regime to break down. And when a transition is initiated through nonviolent resistance, it ends in at least a minimal level of democracy around 80% of the time. A success rate that is vastly higher than any other method of change. And so again, I think the basic question of are the gains of major nonviolent resistance movements sustained into the future, at least when it comes to questions of democracy, the answer is undoubtedly yes, and the data is very, very clear on this question. But then, of course, a natural question arises, when you present any kind of, basic statistical relationship like this, but why and how, and is this, can we trust this based on what actually happens on the ground, or is this just some kind of strange statistical artifact? So I want to talk a little bit about the reasons why we see this particular relationship. What is the connection between the method of nonviolent resistance and the longer-term outcome of democracy? And I'm going to highlight three mechanisms in particular that lead us from the moment, a moment like Tahrir Square, of mass mobilization in the streets, to longer-term sustained democratic political institutions. And the first has to do with leaders. So when you initiate a political change through nonviolent resistance, when sort of the major forces that have come together to create political change are, not the leaders of rebel groups or long-term political elites, but people who have been, leading activist organizations or been involved in, these kinds of nonviolent political struggles. These are different kinds of people. These are different sorts of leaders are elevated into positions of political prominence through processes of nonviolent resistance than through other kinds of processes. And so, for instance, I think an excellent example of this is Václav Havel, who you can see pictured on the slide here. Václav Havel, of course, began his career as a playwright. Perhaps not the most obvious career into political influence. But from his position as a playwright, later became involved with groups of artists and intellectuals who were involved in activism. This later led him to a central position in the Velvet Revolution in 1989 that overthrew the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, and later to a position as president of Czechoslovakia, where he was able to oversee not only a transition to democracy, but in what I think is a truly remarkable case, the peaceful separation of Czechoslovakia into two countries, which was by no means something that was automatically determined. As again, Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham's research would show you quite, secession does not happen peacefully in many cases. In most cases, these kinds of demands for national self-determination end in some kind of violent struggle at some point. So this is our first mechanism, that when you have a major moment of political change happening through nonviolent resistance, different kinds of people tend to rise to political prominence. And again, I will, as Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham said, I would not be an academic if I did not caveat everything that I say. I'll have some bigger caveats coming on later. Of course, this is not everyone. There are sort of activist leaders who do not have the democratic coalition building, peace loving credentials of someone like Václav Havel. I'll talk about a couple of them a little bit later. But on average, as opposed to other ways of creating political change, different sorts of leaders tend to rise to prominence in campaigns of nonviolent resistance. Second, because mass nonviolent resistance campaigns, the kind that do lead to regime change, tend to involve large numbers of participants from across political spectrums, from a variety of different kinds of perspectives, those campaigns, in order to succeed, typically rely on compromise and negotiation. Because you have people from many different backgrounds and many different political perspectives who all need to agree that we need to mobilize people into the streets in order to achieve change. And so the process of nonviolent resistance itself tends to elevate norms around compromise, negotiation, and cooperation. That, again, the sort of, the leaders, the organizations, the individuals who have participated in a mass nonviolent resistance campaign gain experience in negotiating their problems rather than fighting through their problems. And this then is, in many ways we might say, the core of what healthy democracy looks like. That struggles between differing political opinions are not escalated to their extreme, but that they are characterized by negotiation and compromise. And so I think one excellent example of this, which is pictured on the screen here, is the 2006 revolution in Nepal, which overthrew that country's monarchy and initiated a transition to democracy. And one particularly fascinating characteristic of this revolution is that it was preceded by a 10-year civil war in which Maoist revolutionaries, led by the gentleman on the right here, who went by the name Prachanda, had been in the mountains of Nepal, waging a sort of a Maoist revolution for almost a decade. And they had succeeded, as many guerrillas are able to do, in capturing rural areas, but had no capacity to actually take any of Nepal's major cities. And so, in the early 2000s, as kind of their civil war had kind of ground to a stalemate, the Maoist revolutionaries went through this process that Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham brought up before, of saying violence has not been effective for us. This has not worked. We need to find a different path. And so, to achieve that path, they turned to men like the man on the left here, Girija Prasad Koirala, who was the head of the political party, the Nepali Congress, a sort of a political party founded on Gandhian principles, actually originally inspired by the Indian National Congress to the south, and which had been waging a nonviolent struggle for a return to parliamentary democracy in Nepal. And both the Maoist rebels and the mainstream political parties recognized, on our own, we do not have sufficient power, sufficient leverage to be able to challenge the dictatorship of the king. But together, if we pool our resources, the mainstream political parties in the cities, the Maoists in the country, then we can have sufficient pressure to be able to really challenge the monarchy. And so the two sides agreed to work together in exchange for the Maoists saying, we will pause our armed struggle, we will shift our tactics to nonviolent tactics, and we will work together to achieve the kind of political change that we want to achieve. They were successful, and then in the years following, were able to establish a peace agreement between the two sides and initiate a longer-term political transition. Okay, so elevating different kinds of leaders, changing the sort of norms of political behavior, and finally, and I think in many ways I would say this is perhaps the most crucial, that nonviolent resistance diffuses skills and experience of engaging in political struggle widely throughout society. And again, this relates to the question of participation that Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham brought up previously. That the kinds of mass campaigns that tend to lead to regime change and initiating political transitions tend to involve very large numbers of people and a wide range of different kinds of organizations that if in sort of violent struggles or other processes of political change tend to not be politically activated as much. And so when these groups are politically activated, they gain both, I would say, the cognitive liberation, the knowledge that change is possible through these kinds of tactics, the knowledge that they have the power to achieve political change even without the intervention of political elites, and the specific organizing skills around planning the kinds of tactics that can then be used to pressure political elites later on. And so, put all these things together, this set of new kinds of leaders who are likely to be more sympathetic and supportive of democracy, more protective of human rights, norms of cooperation and compromise, and then a society with the knowledge that change is possible and the skills to hold elites to account combines to lead to this democratizing advantage that I started with. Now, this is kind of where my research on the connections between nonviolent resistance and democracy started. In the years since then, I've examined kind of a number of other dimensions related to these longer-term impacts of nonviolent resistance on political institutions. And the picture, I think, I'm going to tell you some more good news before we get to some of the caveats. So in addition to making a minimal level of democracy more likely, nonviolent resistance also improves the quality of democracy. So I think as many of us know, many countries may be called democracies, and yet the protection of human rights, the sort of quality of elections there vary incredibly widely. And so within that subset of countries that are at least minimally democratic, political regimes that have been created through nonviolent resistance tend to have better quality democratic institutions. Their quality of representation tends to be better, and in particular, they tend to have much stronger protections for basic human rights around freedom of expression and freedom of association. Which is, I think, intuitive, again, when one thinks about sort of nonviolent resistance as an initiating force for new political institutions. If the people who are designing your new political system are themselves activists who have suffered violence at the hands of the state, who have been punished for their freedom of expression in the past, they are likely to care a lot about protecting freedom of expression and freedom of association in the sort of new political regime. So nonviolent resistance not only makes democracy just in a broad level more likely, when democracy occurs, if it occurs through nonviolent resistance, it is also of higher quality. However, another sort of caveat, as we all know, for many, democracies may sort of provide a lot of political inclusion to some groups, but not others. I'm an American. I come from the United States, where many people in our country have suffered from been excluded from political power. Nonviolent resistance also increases the political inclusion of historically excluded groups. across a number of dimensions as well. So both increasing sort of the broad level of political inclusion, but also increasing political inclusion along dimensions of gender, class, and ethnicity as well. That political regimes that are come about through nonviolent resistance are more likely to protect the rights of women. They are more likely to have greater economic equality, to provide greater political power to working classes. And also, they are less likely to politically exclude people on the basis of ethnic identity as well. And so, again, I think a lot of good news. Increased democracy, increased democratic equality, increased political inclusion. However, today, of course, many democracies around the world are struggling with the phenomenon of democratic backsliding. That countries that have, in many cases for many decades, had very strong protections of basic democratic rights, are now seeing rollbacks of those rights and the centralization of executive power in the hands of people like, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or, and again now, I'm from the United States, President Donald Trump as well. And this is something that I've been doing some more research on more recently, and here too, nonviolent resistance has a powerful effect in protecting against democratic backsliding. This is some research I conducted with my colleague Claire Trilling. We looked at episodes of democratic backsliding from around the world, looked both at the presence of nonviolent resistance and also the outcomes of these sort of episodes of democratic backsliding, periods where democratic institutions are being challenged. And what we found was very clear. When there was no organized nonviolent resistance, the probability that democracy was going to be protected was very, very low. When there is organized nonviolent resistance, the probability that democracy will be protected is much, much higher. Essentially, many of the sort of earlier findings I was showing you are about the transition from authoritarianism to democracy, but even within established democracies, nonviolent resistance remains a crucial protective avenue as well. Okay, so that's all the good news. I want to say a few of those caveats and talk a little bit about some of the challenges a little bit more in these sort of transitions from nonviolence to democracy. So, I showed you this slide at the beginning saying, we have this, wonderful success rate of nonviolent resistance leading to democracy of around 80%. But of course, this means too that around 20% of political transitions that are started through nonviolent resistance don't even reach a very minimal level of democracy. And so what explains that subset? Why do we sometimes, we have, as in Egypt, the example that I started with, we have these sort of major moments of mass mobilization that succeed in ousting a political regime, that succeed in creating a political transition, and yet do not end in democracy. And the argument that I've made both in my book and across much of my work since then is that what explains these differences can largely be attributed to political choices that are made during the transition itself. And so first, I will say the biggest threat, the biggest way in which we see political transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance returning to some form of dictatorship is from within. It is from transitional governments. And there are two variants of that. The first is that transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance, because they don't have this sort of destructive impact of transitions initiated through violence, because they often involve that kind of negotiation, compromise, and collaboration that I was talking about before, they mean also that many times sort of old regime elites, elements of the former dictatorship are still present. And can attempt to overturn the revolution in a counter-revolution. Again, the case of Egypt that I brought up before is an example of this. And yet, there is also a challenge from within the movement itself. This is something that I've focused on quite a bit in my recent work, which is that there are cases where, people unlike Václav Havel, people who have at one point been themselves leaders of nonviolent movements, later turn their back on the kinds of protections that they claimed they were fighting for, the democracy and human rights that they in many cases suffered significantly for, and once in power, they overturn the political regimes that they helped create. And in sort of a paper that is under review right at the moment, so we'll see what happens with that. Some co-authors and I find that the biggest factor that explains this is, it can be said quite simply, it is the corrupting influence of power. It is that the biggest predictor of whether former activists will overturn democracy after a political transition has happened is the degree of power and influence that they have during the political transition. For my book, I examined the political transition in Zambia in the 1990s and heard an anecdote from many different people who were involved in that transition about Zambia's president, Frederick Chiluba, who's one of the activists who, again, for many decades had suffered as primarily a labor activist, fighting for labor rights and later for democracy in that country. And in their sort of campaign in 1991, phenomenally successful, was able to become the president of a newly democratic Zambia. And in a cabinet meeting shortly after his election as president, told many of his former activist friends who were now his cabinet members, "I never knew that power could be so sweet." And many former activists who get a taste of that sweetness of power are then loath to give it up. So this is the first major challenge that I think that explains a great deal of that 20% of cases where nonviolent resistance does not lead to long-term democracy. And yet there are some strategies that can help to counter this. And the first, I think, is particularly relevant for this audience, which is that in some work with a couple of co-authors of mine and I, we find that the movements that are best able to sustain democratic progress after their success are those that have significant participation from organizations that are focused on faith and work. Religious organizations, labor unions, and professional organizations. And in sort of examining a number of cases, what we find is that the reason for this is that while, again, say the Catholic Church may become involved in major struggles for democracy and human rights. Of course, the Catholic Church's primary mandate is not to struggle for democracy and human rights. It is to keep the faith. It is to continue to spread the message of Jesus. And so this, of course, means that while the infrastructure, the networks of the Catholic Church may sometimes be appropriated for revolutionary purposes, those networks maintain on into the future, even once the revolution has passed, once a new political regime is in place. And so when movements have incorporated organizations like the Catholic Church that are still in place, are still continuing their daily work on into a new political regime, they maintain an ability to remobilize when democracy or human rights are threatened. They are still, the networks that run through organizations like the Catholic Church are still present in the future. And if people, like, again, the Frederick Chiluba mentioned previously, attempt to roll back democratic progress, they can be called upon again in a much more easier and more straightforward fashion than for organizations that are focused, solely on fighting revolutions, even nonviolent revolutions, that then may demobilize once the revolution is past. In addition, of course, there's an importance for creating political accountability, for not just creating structures of democracy, but also structures to keep new political leaders in check as well. This ranges through anti-corruption bodies, electoral institutions, etc. And then as well, I think something that I focused on in a lot of my work as well is having movements that are not exclusively centered on one or two main political actors, not on one or two, whether this be one or two charismatic leaders or even one or two political parties. That power within movements is diffused across many different actors so that no single actor can capture the political transition. Okay. In addition to this, strategies for continuing to protect and build democracy after a transition has been initiated, I think one key factor is building a shared vision of the future. That movements against authoritarian regimes are often what are called negative coalitions. That they are brought together by what they oppose rather than what they support. They can agree that they want a dictatorship gone, but there is often vast disagreement over what a new political regime is going to look like. And when an initial breakthrough happens, when a dictator is ousted, when a political transition begins, coalitions that are characterized purely by what they oppose often either demobilize, they go home, opening up space for anti-democratic elites to rise to power, or they fragment. They turn against one another, and in ways that can often escalate into violent, destabilizing structures. And so I think it is crucial for even before success happens, when movements are building themselves, that they are centered not just on what they oppose, not just on what they want to get rid of, but on what they want the future to look like. And I think here too, the Catholic Church can play an incredibly important role in saying, we have a vision of a future, a vision of a just society, a vision of a beloved community. That is not just a negative absence of dictatorship, but is the presence of justice and the presence of harmony. And I think an excellent example of this comes from the country of Brazil, that waged a struggle against military dictatorship in the 1970s and 1980s. And when I've spoken to Brazilian activists about this, they emphasized that while they were fighting a struggle against the country's military dictatorship, they didn't frame their struggle just in terms of we want the military gone. They framed it in terms of what they wanted to come next. That the military's presence was an obstacle to the kind of future that they wanted for their country, and that they articulated that vision of what they wanted that future to look like, rather than simply focusing on the negative goal of ousting the military. And finally, and Nicholas, you'll be happy to see this final point, there is a deeply important connection between nonviolent resistance, struggles on the street to break down political institutions, and also around negotiation, around coming together in dialogue to talk about what we want the future to look like. And in political transitions, dialogue is particularly crucial. Because political institutions are destabilized, because the picture of the future is unclear, we don't know what things are going to look like, tensions can escalate very quickly and turn to violence very quickly. And so there is a real need for dialogue to reconcile those varying visions of the future and come together around a shared idea of what that future is going to look like. And so I think an excellent example of this comes from Tunisia, an example that many of you may be familiar with. After that country's 2011 revolution, there was escalating violence over the role of religion in society, over the question of whether Tunisia was going to move towards having a stronger role for Islam in the country's political institutions. The country, many experts on Tunisia would say, was on the verge of civil war when we got to 2013, 2014. And at this point, 4 civil society organizations intervened to say, we can't get to this point in our country. We need to sort of protect the gains of what we have gained, through nonviolence, and organized a national dialogue, including all the country's major political actors, that created a new constitution and prevented a civil war, something they later won the Nobel Peace Prize for. And in some research that I've done with my colleague Veronique Dudoué, we look at these kinds of dialogue processes across all transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance. And what we find in our research is that dialogue itself, just meeting to talk, is insufficient. What really matters is inclusion. What matters is who is actually talking, who is actually present in these dialogue processes. If you're just having a sort of negotiation between political elites, that is unlikely to have any significant effect on sort of producing longer-term democracy and avoiding violent conflict. What you really need is much broader inclusion from across society. The inclusion of women, in particular, is something that we find has a very strong effect, and also a balance of power in the negotiation process, such that everyone who is participating feels that they have a real say and a real stake in what comes next. Okay, and so with that, I will wrap up. So first, I'll say, the main point that I want to emphasize to all of you is that, the promise of nonviolent resistance is real. I think the data is unequivocal on this. I don't think I have to caveat this one, that nonviolent resistance is by far the most promising, the most successful way to establish democracy, to advance democracy, and to protect democracy. The biggest threat to this, the way that this typically goes off the rails, comes from within new and transitional governments, which means that sustained mobilization, which is often best sustained through organizations like the Catholic Church that remain deeply embedded in society over time, is crucial to keep new power holders accountable. A shared vision within movements of a future that everyone wants and is excited about can also help to maintain mobilization and prevent the kinds of fragmentation that can lead to violent escalation. And finally, the last point I just discussed, inclusive dialogue is also crucial in the aftermath of movements to resolve these kinds of escalating tensions and prevent a slide into violence. And I will close with this quote from Gandhi. Real Swaraj, which is Gandhi's term for liberation or self-rule, will come not by the acquisition of authority by a few, but by the acquisition of the capacity by all to resist authority when it is abused. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Wow, again, so deep and so many insights to reflect on, and so well, I give you the word first. Does anyone has any question? Oh yes, that's great that the speakers go into the conversation.
Yeah. You hear me, yeah. Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was just brilliant, the way you zoomed on the key factors and the interplay. I have a question. With all your experience, and you go quite, several decades in history and several cases, could one imagine a form of wave theory? It's a question how you formulate it, but I have this feeling that, there are great moments and things happen, and then there's fragmentation, there's power, corruption, and etc. And it counted us. But you seem to say it doesn't go back as bad as it was, and then maybe it restarts. I don't know if that's taken into account in the way you approach things or not, but I'm interested because, with the backlash we have at the moment, I've got this feeling that that's what we are facing, this constant movement of back and forth in terms of, and that tells us we should never relent, we should never demobilize. So I'd like to see whether wave is a word that you use in your research. And the second question is more focused. You use Nepal as an example. Would you say that what has happened that you've described to us has also some seeds into what has happened recently in Nepal with Gen Z? How does that connect?
Yeah, a couple of great questions, and I think we could. There are so many different ways that we could think about kind of wave theory or the cyclical nature of movements. I think this is something that social movement scholars have been focusing on for a long time. Like, I think Sidney Tarrow's work in particular comes to mind. This idea that movements themselves follow a sort of wave cycle, that you have kind of let's see if I can get my tarot right here. These sort of emergence of new challenger groups who kind of shake up the existing political environment with kind of new tactics outside of institutions. However, those challengers then later become institutional, and then you see an escalation of mobilization. Those challengers become institutionalized. You see a decline in mobilization until a new challenger group emerges at some point in the future. And so you see this sort of like wave structure, of movements. I find the general argument is pretty compelling, in that moments of sort of mass mobilization, like Tahrir Square level of mobilization, are incredibly difficult to sustain. And in part, they gain their power because they are difficult to sustain, because they are so unusual. And so because they are so unusual, they serve as this powerful signal to sort of people, like people in general, and also to people in power as well. And so, kind of by their nature, they lead to these sort of peaks and troughs. Because if they were just sort of like at an even level over time, then they would, lose their power to shock. And so I think there is I think there almost certainly is. I don't know if Tarot ever kind of like looked at, or others who have examined kind of the social movement cycle have ever precisely kind of quantified it in any sort of way. But I think you can definitely see that sort of family resemblance across cases over time. And so I think one thing that I would say is the key challenge is, sort of how do you accelerate the cycle? So how do you say instead of having a peak and then like a short peak and then a long trough and then maybe another short peak, that you have a peak and then there is another peak can come very quickly in response to challenges to human rights or democratic backsliding. And I think on that, there's lots of different work that looks at this in different ways. I think one particularly compelling stream of research, I think of Hank Johnston's work here on this, is the participation of youth as a particularly important factor here. Because, with respect to all of us in the room here, Johnston's argument on this is that once you get to middle age and beyond, and I recently turned 40, so I'm very much thinking about middle age. Once you get to middle age and beyond, your ability to sort of think innovatively declines, and that movements really, those peaks of mobilization really happen when people are able to think innovatively. And so if you are going to have sort of a return to sort of rapid mobilization, you need that kind of innovative and creative tactical thinking that often, most typically comes from youth. And again, I think about, there's statistical work on this as well from people like my friend and colleague, Sirjana Dallam, that sort of show a pretty direct correlation both between the emergence of movements around kind of youth areas and particularly students, and also that movements are more likely to be nonviolent when they have the participation of students as well.
connects to the Nepal story.
Yes, yeah, right. I was saying there's something else I'm not remembering. Yes, Nepal. Yeah, I mean, and so I think, there are a couple of ways that we could think about kind of the connection between 2006 in Nepal and that was last year, right?
Yeah.
The time is blending together in my mind now. And 2025 in Nepal, where I think there is like an example effect, where and there is also there is kind of this sort of mobilization just tends to come in cycles, and there is also, and again I think there is research on this as well, when you have had kind of major nonviolent resistance movements in the past, there's just simply a statistical relationship of you become more likely to have movements in the future. I think in part because of demonstration effects. People have heard the stories of what their parents did, and there is a tactical repertoire that is available to them in the future. Again, I think coming from the United States, the example of the civil rights movement, of course, always looms very large, and when people talk about mobilizing for political change, particularly around civil or human rights in the United States, the example of Dr. King and Bayard Rustin and all the other sort of leaders of the civil rights movement is always sort of invoked, and the tactics that they employed are invoked as well, as kind of just the baseline that people think about in how they're going to go onto the streets. So I think there is definitely that kind of demonstration effect that we can see leading to sort of recurrent mobilization in the future.
Thank you. Other question? Yeah, Sila.
Thank you for all of the ways you stimulated, the thinking moving forward. I'd like you to discuss a little bit more between the dynamic of inclusivity and human rights, because sometimes when you advocate for certain human rights, the group that thought they had them all thinks that by you advocating for particular human rights, you're taking away from a group that felt that they will lose them now. Because, I mean, certainly the dynamic in the United States is their whole group felt very disconnected and then found a way to organize themselves to have, a lot of power. Now, how do we be able to balance that dynamic that currently is in place with a way that the human rights advocacy cannot come as one that's taking away what we have winners and losers? So can you talk a little bit about that, Ken?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had an easy answer for it. Yeah, so I should clarify first, of course, that there are other people who study this in much more focus than I do. My research focus is much more on the resistance side and less on the inclusion side. But I think what Veronique Dudoué and I sort of found in that particular piece that I referenced, the way that we were operationalizing inclusion, how we were considering whether a dialogue was inclusive or not, was more about whether groups that had been historically excluded from power were present at the table. And so, we weren't directly taking on the question that I think you're referencing here of, were the historically included or powerful groups who might feel threatened by new people's rights, were they at the table or not? I think we were sort of assuming in that work, they probably are, because they already have a certain amount of political power. And so I think I don't know that our work can speak directly to the question that you're talking about, other than to say, I think if those people are the only ones at the table, then the table is very unlikely to yield anything significant. And so it is oftentimes a difficult struggle to get sort of, historically powerful, historically included groups to listen to the voices of challenger groups that are that are calling for new and expanded human rights protection. But that is nonetheless that is something that is worth fighting for, that is worth kind of expending effort on, because dialogue processes that don't include the voices of those who have been historically excluded are unlikely to yield any kind of significant improvement. So I wish I had a better answer, but I think that's probably what I can say kind of most confidently based on the research that we've done.
Thank you. Ken.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pinckney. Fabulous presentation. It did strike me, again, from the perspective of the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence, that one of our challenges and opportunities always is to help people in the church, from the leaders on down, to recognize that, A, they are already engaged in nonviolent practices, struggles, opportunities, but also to sharpen that point perhaps in the way that I could see these elements that promote democracy that you listed in terms of leadership, norms of compromise and cooperation, diffuse skills and influences, and then all these elements that improve democracy. It's possible, I think, to invite the church to see that actually a lot of those skills the church is promoting. And therefore engaging in the way that Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham was talking about, that maybe not in some mass mobilization way, but actually is promoting and influencing and supporting those kinds of practices. Interestingly, the church is now engaged in something called the Synod on synodality, walking together. And it really is, we said from the beginning, from our perspective, that synodality is nonviolence. It is dialogue going on around the world. I think your point from your research that inclusivity is critical to that dialogue, I think that could be a nice way of prompting the church to encourage that whatever synodality is going on, that is inclusive, and that the voices of women and other groups that may not have had the focus or presence in terms of leadership and power are part of that. But I'm constantly trying to think of ways to invite the church to realize it's not that it long has been part of these kinds of elements of nonviolence. I just wonder if you haven't thought about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree completely, and I think this speaks to the point that Dr. Duvernay brought up previously about sort of cycles and waves, and that the moments of mass mobilization are moments, and yet the work of they don't come out of nowhere. They may sometimes seem as if they come out of nowhere, and yet they are built on the foundation of connection, dialogue, network building, normal institutional life that happens in these more ordinary times. I mentioned the example of the civil rights movement previously, and I think everyone in the United States knows the story of Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. And often how that is told is, oh, this was just one person who just made a decision one day, and then sort of things just sort of exploded afterwards. And that's not what actually happened. What actually happened is that, many people had refused to give up their seats on segregated buses previously. What happened is that the local churches and the local chapter of the NAACP said, okay, this is our moment. Rosa Parks is someone who is admired, who is respected in the community, who has all these sort of characteristics that make her a good example. Let's take this moment and then mobilize around it. And again, the church was absolutely central to that effort. Like, that was the mobilizing infrastructure of the civil rights movement, and particularly the Montgomery bus boycott. If any of you have not read Stride to Freedom, Dr. King's book about the Montgomery bus boycott, I highly recommend it. Both it is like, it's an excellent, very engaging read, and also, as a scholar of nonviolent resistance, it is probably the best case study of a nonviolent resistance movement you will ever come across. About like all of the very like detailed, nitty-gritty, down-to-earth steps of how does a movement emerge, how does it develop, what are the challenges that it faces, and how does it how does it resolve or not resolve. And again, I think that example, and again you'll see the central place of the sort of the ideals of the church and the organizing infrastructure of the church are absolutely central to that story. And so I think, to your point of recognizing the place of nonviolence, not just as those kind of moments of visible mobilization in the streets, but of the whole process, the whole sort of interconnected process that has to happen in order for those moments to occur, I think is absolutely crucial as well. Whenever I teach on nonviolent resistance, we always read Gandhi's sort of short book, Hind Swaraj, which is again another one I would highly recommend to all of you if you haven't read it. And one thing that Gandhi talks about in that book is that he raises exactly this point, that violence is unusual. Violence is alien to how human beings interact almost all of the time. And if it weren't the case, that nonviolence was the way that we interacted with each other, the way that we resolved conflict, the overwhelming majority of the time, humanity would have ceased to exist a long time ago. We don't recognize this because of the biases inherent in the way that we talk about history. And so I think I think the first time I read Hind Swaraj, that kind of broke my brain. It kind of just reoriented the whole way I thought about the world a little bit, and saying, oh yeah, these sort of processes of the nonviolent deployment of power and power, pressure, negotiation are present everywhere, and not so exceptional as we might think sometimes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pinckney, and thank you all for all your questions. I think we are, very on time, so I think we can make a brief break now for 15 minutes, and we come back and go on with this exciting conversation. So 15 minutes and for the break.
And there's
Finn.